I think we can start.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So I sort of.
Sure, sir.
Yeah. We have a pretty decent audience. I'm sure people will join in by the time the introductions happen. So let's kick off. Rashmi, are you going to start off?
Yes, sir.
Please.
A very good evening to one and all present here, and a warm welcome to our Dean Captain Nagaraj Subbarao, sir, Dr. Annapurna Ravichandar, Ms. Jaishi Marakini Braganza, Mr. D.N. Prahalad, Dr. Sandeep Krishnamurthy, Dr. Shashi Shivaram Krishna, K. Jai Raj Krishna, and all the faculty members, and hearty thank you for everyone joining in here today with us. I'm Rashmi Somashekar, an MBA student at Dayanand Sagar University. As we are all aware of the immense toll that COVID-19 has taken on us, discussion and being informed plays a crucial role, which brings us to this webinar. Today, there's going to be a roundtable discussion on post-COVID-19 scenario and a new paradigm. What does it mean for us? This gives me an immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Annapurna Ravichandar and Ms. Jaishi Marakini Braganza to highlight these important issues with this webinar. Before we start off, I would like to give a quick introduction on Dr. Annapurna Ravichandar. She's an executive director at Public Affairs Foundation and has a PhD in history. She wears a dual hat and she's a head policy engagement and communication and training at Public Affairs Center. She has over 30 years of experience in training and communication. She has held various positions as director training, head policy engagement and communication, to name a few. She has been a recipient of Rotary Award for Exemplary Services in 1999, Vadodara, recipient of Kaluz Gulbenkian Foundation, Portugal from 1985 to 86, and a recipient for University Grants Commission. She was also a fellowship from 1984 to 1988, and she's an associate at One Thing Thanks and executive member at Vadodara Center for Animal Rescue and Emergency. She has published several blog articles and edited books and reports. Welcome, ma'am. Next off, we have Ms. Jaishi Marakini Braganza. She's a postgraduate from XLRI, and she brings with her 20 years corporate experience across sales, marketing, operation, and L&D. She wears many hats with ease. Today, she finds joy as a credentialed ICF coach, a practicing psychotherapist, a mentor for startups, and also business consultant. In all her roles, she's committed to client-centered approach and empowers individuals and enables them to support themselves. I welcome you as well, ma'am. The next two speakers will be introduced by Medha. Over to you, Medha.
Thank you, Rashmi. A very warm welcome and good evening, everyone. I'm Medha Patki and I'm currently in second semester of MBA program at Dayanand Sagar University. It's an honor to have such great speakers with us today. It's been 5 months in Dayanand Sagar University and the gestures we've been receiving is really overwhelming. Right from providing opportunities to successful completion of a given task from us, our Dean, Captain Nagaraj Subbarao sir, and all the professors have played a major role by supporting us in all aspects. So I look forward for more activities that are going to happen soon. With this, I would now take this opportunity to introduce our panelists, Mr. Prahalad and Dr. Sandeep Krishnamurthy. Mr. Prahalad is a graduate from Indian Institute of Science with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. He was one of the earliest employees in Infosys. He served as a board member at Infosys till recently. He has founded other companies like Suryasoft, a company specializing in financial control and risk for banks. Biophy, a medical devices company specialized in use of light. He serves multiple advisory committees in Indian Institute of Science. Welcome you, sir. Thank you. We next have Dr. Sandeep Krishnamurthy. Dr. Sandeep Krishnamurthy is the first dean of the AACSB accredited School of Business at University of Washington, Bothell. This role involves managing the School of Business as its chief academic and administrative officer. He holds PhD from the University of Arizona in marketing with a minor in economics, PGDBM from XLRI, and a BTech in chemical engineering from IIT Bombay. His family hails from Mysuru. Welcome, sir. We have Raksha next. She will be introducing our next two panelists. Over to you, Raksha. Thank you.
Thank you, Medha. Hello, everyone. Very good evening to everyone. I am Raksha M from second semester MBA. I basically belong to Mysore, Karnataka, where I completed my undergraduate in Bachelor of Computer Application. I'm very excited and thankful to our Dean, faculties, and DSS committee for giving me this opportunity. Now, let me introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sashi Shivaram Krishna. He has completed his master's degree in economics from the University of Bombay and PhD from Cornell University, New York, USA. His research interests are in the area of environmental, economic, and monetary history. He has published widely in academic journals, including Business History and many more. He is also a regular contributor to moneycontrol.com and other online magazines like Wire and NewsClick. He is also an author and an avid documentary filmmaker. His films have been screened at several international film festivals as well as National Geographic and Doordarshan. Sir, we are very glad that you are here by accepting our invitation. A warm welcome to you, sir. Now, coming to our final speaker, that is our Dean, Professor Captain Nagaraj Subbarao, sir. Captain Dean, sir, is a Dean, School of Dayanand Sagar School of Commerce and Management Studies and Professor of Leadership and Strategic Development at Dayanand Sagar University. He is a Master Mariner specialized in navigation and ocean engineering. He is an MBA graduate in Human Resource Management and Advanced Specialization in Strategic Leadership from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, USA. Prior to his decade and a half in academia, he spent over 20 years in the Merchant Navy and commanded state-of-art ship. He has the unique distinction of leading multinational crews through odious circumstances all over the world. So we are very proud and happy to welcome you to this session. Now, I'm very delighted to welcome all our professors of MBA and Executive MBA at Dayanand Sagar University and all our participants who are present here, virtual session, who are for sure going to have an interesting and informative session. Before I hand over the session to our Dean, I would like to ask Ms. Anusha Machado to state the ground rules of this session. Over to you, Anusha.
Thank you, Raksha. Good evening, everyone. I welcome all of you for today's webinar. I am Anusha Machado, a student of second semester MBA at Dayanand Sagar University. And now I would like everyone to follow the house rules for this round table session. So those are, the panelists will be taking in the questions for the last 20 minutes of the session. So please write your questions in Q&A section below. The panelists will be taking a few relevant questions and answering them. I also like to say sorry beforehand because we will have to leave out few questions due to the time constraints. I can assure you that this is going to be a very informative and an interesting session. With the hope that the rules are clear to the audience, I request our Dean, Professor Captain Nagaraj Subbarao, to carry forward with the session. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much indeed, students, for introducing our distinguished panelists. Before I request Mr. Jairaj to say a few words and kick off proceedings, I will, he's got a very distinguished record. So, sir, with your permission, I'll very quickly introduce you to the audience. Mr. K. Jairaj is a member of the 1976 batch of the Indian Administrative Service and has held distinguished appointments in the infrastructure, energy, transport, and urban development sectors, including a role as Additional Chief Secretary, Energy Department, and Chairman, BESCOM, Managing Director, Bangalore International Airport Limited, Managing Director, Karnataka Power Corporation Limited, Managing Director, Karnataka State Road Transport Corporation, Commissioner, Bangalore City Corporation for 2 terms, Commissioner for Commercial Taxes and Principal Secretary to the Chief Minister. With Mr. N.R. Narayan Murthy, Chairman Emeritus of Infosys, Mr. Jairaj established the Bangalore International Airport Limited, India's first greenfield airport on public-private partnership with Siemens Germany. Mr. Jairaj served with the World Bank, Washington, D.C., United States, as Senior Public Sector Management Specialist in the Africa region between 2004 and 2006. He has a brilliant academic record. He has a Bachelor of Arts from the Bangalore University, Master of Arts in Economics from the Delhi School of Economics, MPA Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, Princeton University, and MPA Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, USA, where he was Edward Mason Fellow. Mr. Jairaj is active in the national management movement and has served as President, All India Management Association. To briefly tell you about what he has done. Sir, quick few words from you before we kick off.
Yeah. Thank you, Captain, and warm welcome and greetings to all our distinguished participants, distinguished panelists today. Very happy that you have joined the Dayanand Sagar University School of Business Management, thanks to the initiative of Captain Nagaraj Subbarao. Captain pulls out one rabbit after another from his hat, and this is an extraordinary collection of eminent people who are going to speak to more than 150 participants today. So let me observe also the ground rules enunciated so strictly by Anusha and keep my comments to a bare minimum. The second wave of COVID has really affected all of us very badly. The first wave was a kind of a distant phenomena, which afflicted other sections of the community. But now it is closer to home in terms of the misery and the death and the hospitalization that we see around us, including the scramble for hospital beds, for oxygen, for ICU, and so on. So this has really affected all of us immensely. And yet we are the privileged sections of society. We live in a bubble. So what we have undergone is not even a fraction of what people at large have experienced and suffered immensely. But in the wake of the second wave, there are many questions raised, regarding the economic impact of the second wave. What is it going to do in terms of the economy? And incidentally, Bangalore, in Karnataka, there's an extension of 1 more week announced by the government today, which is inevitable. So what is the impact economically? What is the impact socially in terms of, the social cohesion and grouping that we have in our society? And what is the impact psychologically in terms of the mental health of people? I was mentioning to Jayashree yesterday that there was this excellent discussion in BIC chaired by Rohini, who said that, this eminent psychiatrist said that there is a near-death experience for most people that makes them all traumatized. And no matter where they are, what they are doing, however accomplished they are, and how will they get over this trauma? And is there something called traumatic rebound? According to these psychiatrists, if you will that way, you can make this into an opportunity which you can utilize for your own good and for the public good. So these are some of the issues that have cropped up, and I'd like to thank Captain Nagaraj Subbarao for this great opportunity to get so many eminent panelists, my friend Prahalad, Annapurna, Dr. Sandeep Krishnamurthy, Jayashree Braganza, and Dr. Shashi Shivram Krishna. And I wish that this is really going to be a cerebral experience, and we'll benefit individually and collectively from this discussion. Thank you, Captain, and over to you.
Thank you very much, sir, for those introductory words. And we'll kick off round one. I will go to Dr. Shivaramakrishna first. And Shashi, the question is, the COVID-19 crisis seems on the verge of spiraling out of control. The business world has struggled to figure out what COVID meant for the macroeconomy. Extended restrictions limiting human interaction means an end to normal economic production and a resulting global economic crisis. What do you think India should do as we emerge from the pandemic?
Okay, first of all, thank you, Captain, for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you and the students too. So I'm looking forward to some good questions at the end of it. So, I had a concern with the title of the seminar at some point, which is post-pandemic. I think it's a little probably premature to think of a post-pandemic world, since we're actually just going through it, right? And we don't know what's going to happen, in the future, near future, as well as over the course of the next year, maybe, or next 2 years. So being an economist, a macroeconomist at that, we normally look at, economics as a dismal science because we deal with crises, generally speaking. And I have a few major concerns about the Indian economy, right? And this is, we have to address it. And my own opinion there is that we need a lot more state intervention. For me, that's the only way that I think we can cross, this phase. Most of you would know what I'm going to say in terms of figures. I'm not going to talk too much about, facts and figures here because time is short. Right, but we know the first thing that we look at as economists is GDP growth, right? And what we were expecting was a V-shaped recovery since last year. But overall, if you look at the year-to-year growth, it's actually a negative 7.3%, right? Which means that at the, for the fiscal year 2019-2020, which ended on 31st March 2020, our GDP was approximately 145 trillion rupees, which is 145 lakh crore Indian rupees. And for this year, ending 31st March 2021, the GDP is only about 135 trillion rupees, which means a negative growth rate of 7.3%. Of course, this is one indicator. Right? But this affects everything, including, for instance, the GDP per capita and so on. But this figure doesn't tell the entire story because, as Mr. Jairaj has mentioned, there is a vast majority of people in India in the informal sector who are, hurt, and which doesn't really come directly into these GDP figures. So the way GDP estimates are made is that the informal sector is taken to be about 60% of the formal sector. And obviously, the negative growth which has happened in the informal sector could be much, much larger, which means that, it's just a guess of how badly GDP may be actually affected. So my concerns are mainly, one is regarding the informal sector, which even today employs 85 to 90% of the workforce, which is really, according to me, a decline which started after demonetization and has been continuing, and the shock has actually impacted them in a major way. So the second concern as a macroeconomist that I have is about unemployment. Some of it might, rebound with when the lockdowns cease, but some of it could be actually a kind of chronic situation now, which really doesn't, just get back to normal as soon as things open. My other concern is regarding inequalities. I think this is something that we as macroeconomists must keep in mind, because rising inequalities is something which is going to affect our long-term trajectory in our growth. right? So even if we imagine a post-pandemic phase, it's not like everything is going to come back to normal, right? So for us to get back on that 7 to 8% growth trajectory is going to be a major challenge, I think, in the slightly longer term. A few points that I would like to touch on is, one is that what's happening now in the world is that some countries are getting back, to where they were in the pre-COVID phase, right? So take, for instance, China, which has actually showed positive growth, as well as USA is now almost back to their pre-pandemic levels. So that's something which global inequalities are going to be on the rise, right? Which has its own implication for geopolitics, supply chains, and all that kind of concerns that we might have. And so what is the way out of this is that, if you look at what the US has done, is they've been spending massively. Their fiscal deficits are about 18-20% of GDP, right? I think we have to do a lot more there. Of course, there will be concerns in India about inflation or stagflation maybe, but we have to really, leverage our sovereignty, monetary sovereignty, to begin to spend more. And maybe in the latter part of this, I would like to, what kind of spending that we need to undertake, in order to kickstart the economy in some sense, because private sector investment spending has really been, on the decline. It's not just during the pandemic, but like I said, it's been a kind of a secular stagnation that we have observed. Private sector investment spending has been gradually declining over the last 6-7 years, and it's this year has been abysmal. So how do we, that's the main driver of economic growth, not consumption spending, right? So we need private sector investment spending a lot more, but that's not going to happen automatically because it's so complex, right? Like you were talking about psychology and, consumer confidence, right? Is at an all-time low today, right? So it's going to be a really complex phase. And overall, my whole take would be that we need more state involvement in this to get the economy out of where we are. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thanks, Shashi. So I just once was tempted to ask you whether we should print more money, and I think we'll come to that in your second half.
Sure.
When you address the audience again. We'll go to Dr. Sandeep Krishnamurthy. Sandeep, as medical researchers and pharmaceutical companies race to develop treatments and a vaccine for COVID-19, they show how repurposing knowledge, resources, and technology already at hand can be a valuable innovation strategy, and they have done an amazing job indeed. Do you think that this momentum can be sustained post the pandemic and benefit people around the world, particularly, of course, India, since we are concerned with India and what's happening here? Sandeep.
Yeah, thank you, Captain. I think, generally speaking, I think the pandemic has sparked an innovative, outburst, in many sectors. For example, pharmaceutical and health care definitely is one of the sectors. But we also know, for example, that in the digital world, there has been an explosion in terms of innovations as, the IT companies really push to find a way to serve the needs. So when it comes to the pharmaceutical companies, I think there is a massive push to really understand how it is that vaccines itself, we should be thinking about in the future. So already here, people are talking about, COVID vaccines becoming a regular part of one's life. So when we think about COVID vaccines, we're all thinking about just taking it now and thinking that we'll be done with it. But it is going to become a regular part of life where every so often we'll have to take a booster shot, and things like that. The vaccines efficacy has improved. The expansion to younger audiences has increased, etc., etc. But the central issue that I think is going to have to be recognized at some point is that you know, the intellectual capital that is locked into those vaccines should be made broadly available. And as you saw, you know, probably in the public sphere, there was some disagreement there. Bill Gates initially came out and said that pharmaceutical companies should not be forced to give away their IP. But I think, you know, given the political atmosphere now, I think there's, you know, a high chance that the pharmaceutical companies will be persuaded to see that at least some very careful release of IP is going to, you know, really be needed, because in some cases it's going to make the difference between, you know, life and death, you know. And I think that is something that is not lost on anybody. um, in addition to that, I think there is a lot of discussion of how the variants of COVID are going to, you know, pick up over time, and how can the vaccines actually keep up with that. In particular, there is a worry that, you know, whether the vaccines can actually handle, you know, the speed of mutations, you know, as that, you know, takes place. And I think there, you know, we already have the flu shot, which is very common in the US, where, you know, people are used to taking it, you know, every year. And there is a process in place there, you know. Although there are many strains of the flu virus, typically a committee gets together, and in any particular region they figure out that, you know, this particular you know, strain of flu is what is going to drive the vaccination process, you know, this year. But overall, I think you know, some of you may be interested to know that there is a lot of misinformation in the US as well. And one of the behavioral issues that has come up, was not anticipated, is getting people to take the second dose. A whole lot of people have taken the first dose, but, you know, vaccination centers are now finding out that, for example, Pfizer, Moderna required 2 doses. And what we're finding out is that people have a sense of invulnerability and invincibility after they take the first dose, and they are not showing up for the second dose. And the actual protocol that was used to approve those vaccines, you know, indicates that you have to take both the doses. So there's going to be some supply demand imbalances, with inventories just getting stuck in the vaccination centers, you know, getting wasted and things like that, which is, you know, truly unfortunate. So I also hope that if that increases, and if there are vaccines simply, you know, sitting here, and they would otherwise go to waste, that there are mechanisms by which it can be sent to countries where it can actually help people. And I think but, you know, there are logistical challenges to overcome, because the inventory might be stuck in a local, you know, drugstore, as opposed to a central repository. So it's hard to coordinate that, and, you know, we'll have to work with multiple agencies to figure things like that out. But that's the other thing to know, that that I think the projections in terms of how many vaccines are needed, and the actual number of, you know, vaccines being handed out, you know, are you know, there's quite a gap already, and inventory is starting to build in some centers, and that effect is going to actually, you know, continue to play out over the coming months. But overall, you know, I think it's my view that you know, the innovative spirit of companies is really important to keep in mind. And I think that you know, although this is a horrendous once in a lifetime, you know, experience for all of us, you know, I don't know about all of you, but definitely for me, this is a, you know, more than a black swan. It is a extraordinary event that has led to, you know, massive worldwide, you know, lockdown and gridlock of various sorts. So so I think we are going to come out of this stronger. So that is still my optimistic belief, and I think the innovative spirit of the startups, the companies, I think is going to help us, you know, get there. So my encouragement is for everyone to keep an eye on that, and you know, try to, you know, still, you know, understand that, you know, there is so much more in the coming years that we are going to see, you know, that is going to come out of the innovative spirit. So thank you, Captain. Over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Sandeep. Yeah. So the next question will be for Dr. Annapurna Ravichandar. Um, so, Madam, considering that what we have seen in Bengaluru, can we even solve big public problems anymore? And the huge challenges we face are daunting: climate change, crumbling infrastructure, declining public education, social services. At the same time, we've come to accept the sad notion that governments can't do new things or solve tough problems. It's too big, too slow, and mired in bureaucracy. What are your thoughts? Dr. Krishnamurthy left us with some positive note, saying that we are innovative and creative, and we find solutions. But what are your points of view?
Thank you so much, Captain. Thank you for inviting me to be one of the panelists and speaker. I think this is an excellent question and very relevant. I would like to start by stating that scalability and sustainability can only come from the government. However, I would like to add that the government alone cannot be the sole body that can bring about changes or address issue like the COVID-19. For example, as you just stated that if you take climate change, who has to save the environment? Is it the government or organizations or corporate or academic institutions like yours or you or I? I believe that each and every one of us just named has got a major role to play. It is critical to address this issue since it often directly impacts the economy and perhaps the politics of the country. So now how does this work? One of the key things to remember is that solving social problems or issues largely depends on identifying the causes. A lot of times we do not look at the root cause for issues that we have. So the role of government here is to ensure that it introduces public policies which are both viable and actionable. So how do they do it? Coming from a public policy institute, I can say that they try and gather information and they design a policy for implementing the same. However, they need to keep in mind that there could be several factors that affect an issue, but need to pin on the key factor, because we can very truthfully say that all issues do not have only one factor, they have several. But at the same time, like you said, for paucity of time to speed enough, we should start at least trying to pinpoint the major issue and then the others will fall in place. So how do we go about it? One of the solutions perhaps could be organized action, which needs to be encouraged, where every stakeholder that I just named has a defined role to play. Just introducing a policy is not enough. Customizing it and understanding how it will actually impact needs to be kept in mind, and most important, how it needs to be rolled out to reach the people, the masses, and you and I. So in our experience in our organization, we believe, and I think already someone stated, just one of the esteemed speaker, data plays a very important part to address this. See, unless and until we know what actually people want, be it in the urban or rural areas, their needs are to be gathered, analyzed, customized, and then only implemented. Coming to implementation, sometimes a problem can be solved by the combination of organized and personalized action, like economists would say, at both the macro and the micro levels. In other words, we need to think of a national, state, panchayat, and community level addressing of policies, because it's very difficult in a country like India, which is so vast, so different, even within the state, within the district, that one policy may not work, or like people say, one shoe may not fit all. If you take, for example, the problem of education, it's very important that deploying technology may help in democratizing education. In fact, COVID-19 has taught us this very well. No education has stopped. It may have slowed down. Using innovative approaches, like somebody said, and you just stated it, community radio stations, online teaching, using simple technology to impart education should be one role where Organizations, corporate, UI, academic institutions should support the government because they may have the knowledge, but they may not have the capabilities and the capacity. A more systematic approach would mean that decision making should become data driven, independent, and not arbitrary. However, one needs to keep in mind that just using technology is not enough. For example, in the field of education, the government needs to think of far-fetched targets. For example, some of the stories that have come out during COVID is people or teachers in the rural areas are struggling to use a technology-based approach to education. Now, one way of solving this is to actually enhance the skill in using simple technology. And this is not just in rural, because I am also in the education field, and I'm working with a lot of education departments and organizations. They say that this is one of the things, even in the urban areas. Sometimes a teacher is something as simple as mute your mic. The student is talking, so there's a vessel banging at the back or something is happening. So these are some of the things that training has to be given. Finally, I strongly believe a holistic approach will not only mitigate some of the problems, but also encourage all stakeholders to do more. The government alone is not responsible to solve problems for all of us. So I stop over here.
Thank you, Dr. Ravichander. So the government alone is not responsible for all our problems, and we need to pitch in, and it's a team effort, if I can sort of reduce it to very simplistic levels.
Absolutely.
Thank you, and we'll come back to you later in round 2. I would like to go to Prahalad, sir. Sir, Madam talked about the government, and it's a collaborative effort, but I will approach the question that is posed to you on a more industry-specific basis. While some have described the COVID-19 pandemic as a black swan event, in reality, it should be treated as a black elephant, a cross between a black swan event and the elephant in the room. And we've sort of, been hearing about an impending pandemic and so on and so forth, but people were not prepared. From climate change to cybersecurity, there are plenty of other visible, looming black elephant events that companies should be preparing for, but apparently are not. Successful companies need to build in resilience to prepare for these events around 3 areas: governance, leadership, development, and compensation, where boards play a special role in preparation for future threats. Your thoughts, sir?
Right. Thank you, Captain. Thank you, everyone. I'll try to keep my answers short and relevant. The answers are not obvious. Governance alone, or the governmental rules, as Dr. Ravichandra was saying, is not adequate. Let me illustrate that. Regulations have been very weak for a long time. In fact, the company I worked for went public in '93 and started producing quarterly results much before it became the norm. The fact that a young company could actually jolt the regulator into action speaks volumes of how bad it was before some of the companies started doing good governance. The second question about governance of the regulator, the law brought in by a regulator has no teeth. Generally, what happens is the person breaking the law gets a slap on the wrist, and in the background gets a pat on the back as well, for whatever it's worth. So the law is meaningful only if there's punishment for breaking it. We have seen a lot of insider trading. We know that there have been numerous breaches, but the law has not really acted on anybody. Very, very, sketchy actions have been taken. Related party transactions have gone unpunished, and this leads me to conclude that the law is there. The regulator, let's understand, is there only to embarrass us, but not punish. So that's my talk about governance. Now, coming back to what companies can do. Now, no one can predict what you term as a black swan event. It just cannot happen, because if it can be predicted, it's no longer a black swan. As simple as that. Now, their risk committees, their chief risk officers, They cannot anticipate that event. But one can certainly anticipate is the impact of such events. So preparations for business continuity, preparations for disruptions, action plans, contingency plans to be drawn up way beforehand, or some things that every company's board should seriously look at. Now, if you take if you study the Form 20, which is the risk part that is filed with a regulator in the US, not many people have listed pandemic as a risk. There are very few, and that includes pharma industries. They've neither listed it as a risk nor as a business opportunity, which basically means that these are uncontrollable events. We have to face them. And I don't think any dependence on government and regulator is going to help anybody. Self-regulation is far superior to someone else telling us what to do, because we are more interested in our business than someone else outside. Now, coming back to these black elephant events, which are definitely there. First of all, they're not really a combination of black swan and elephant. They're simply elephants. Most elephants, as you know, Captain, are gray, except maybe that mythical white elephant called Airavata, which Jairaj sir knows a lot about. Now, these events need very special look at the board level. I've been doing some survey on behalf of a couple of organizations on what I think is one of the most major risks the world is going to face, which is cyber security. We are in a totally interconnected world. There are going to be geopolitical actors, non-state actors, state actors. They're going to be criminals. They're going to be casual, fun seekers. You expose yourself to all of them. This is no longer a technology issue, but most boards that I've talked to have treated it as a technology issue. They say, no, our chief technical officer gives us an update every quarter. Now, I keep telling them, look, it should be a chairman level issue. You need to talk about it every month rather than every quarter, but no one is taking it seriously. For instance, when one of the first things I did as a chair of risk committee in Infosys is to form a cybersecurity committee. That was the first step we took. And we got a whole bunch of experts to come and examine what we are doing. We elevated the CISO to a board reporting level and said he should not be constrained by the CEO. Because CEO may say, I have no funds for some of this, which again could lead down to a path which is disastrous. So therefore, we need to take these two things, which is climate change, which is having a serious impact on the company in the long term, and cybersecurity, which is a threat, which is a part of life. It's like blood pressure, it's going to be there. It's a question of how bad or how good it is what you can regulate. Now, of course, there's a request to regulators, obviously saying that make that mandatory, like you made the nominations committee and audit committee mandatory. I think government also should move a little bit. But again, my view is governments can't do much. It's us who can do more. Coming back to your second question, leadership culture is important. Somehow in our culture, we have come to believe that private good is more important than public good. And this is the very antithesis of a Ramarajya, which we all say we aspire to. For example, one of our former prime ministers used a naval warship as a cruise ship for a holiday. If this is the accountability at the top of the pyramid, can you imagine what kind of accountability the promoter of a public company has? It's probably close to zero. Therefore, we need to have leadership, and this leadership is absolutely essential. And leadership will not develop by talk. Talk is meaningless. It's only action that leads to good leadership. Again, I quote the military, and I really admired a lecture by Colin Powell about which I can't talk right now. It's too big a topic. But please leave a thought with all of you students and everyone here on the panel. A military leader can get people to give up life for a mythical entity called a country. It's an imaginary entity. There's no such entity at all in nature. Whereas, as a leader, I find it difficult to get people to write good code. And, sure, in your respective professions, you have difficulties. Think about it. What is it that these guys do differently from the rest of us? Compensation, no, I mean, there's a question I don't know much about. I believe that everyone should be fairly compensated. And second, I'm a strong believer in compassionate capitalism. Capitalism is the only answer, but it has to be not crass capitalism that doesn't have compassion. I cringe when I think about the difference in pay between the lowest paid person in a company and the CEO. The CEO is not responsible for the good of the company. A lot of people are. While we cannot equate everybody's contributions, also overvaluing contributions of certain individuals is, I think, unfortunate evil that has crept in, which I do believe in our committees all over the world at board levels should take this seriously, because it has a severe impact on society and aspirations of people. So I'll stop at this point. Obviously, like to, people can ask me questions.
Thank you very much, sir. And very interesting analogies between leadership in the civilian space, in the military, and how you look at governance and public governance versus private governance. And yes, the incident of a warship being used as a cruise ship pretty much shocked the nation. We'll come back to you in round two, sir. We'll go to Jayashree, madam. Madam, you're a psychotherapist and a coach as well, and a very distinguished one at that. The COVID-19 second order crisis is starting to emerge. The toll it is taking on our mental health is beginning to show up in different fora. In a global study of more than 2,700 employees across more than 10 industries, undertaken by Qualtrics and SAP during March and April a while ago, 75% of people say they feel more socially isolated. 67% of people report higher stress levels. 57% are feeling greater anxiety, and 53% say they feel more emotionally exhausted. What can CEOs and managers do? What is your advice, madam?
Thank you, Captain Nagaraj. That's a very important question that you have raised there. The truth is that everybody is grieving, right? Everybody is stressed or anxious to various degrees. Like Jairaj sir mentioned a while ago, people are right now living through trauma. I will speak about post-traumatic stress disorder maybe later in our conversation, and right now focus on what can leaders do now as this is unfolding around us, right? So the thing with mental health is that we could all be operating at different levels of response on a continuum, right? But we are all there on that continuum. We are not off it. Some of us are able to have more resilience, and for some, COVID has really hit home and the impact is tremendous, right? So what can leaders do? And extending what Dr. Annapurna said recently about organized effort, organizations and leaders need to have an all-encompassing plan. Leaders can't kind of stumble ahead or feel their way around this, right, and figure out as they go. Mr. Prahalad mentioned the need for decisive leadership, and I think this is what is required even in the space of mental health of employees. So what can leaders do? To start with, I think the first focus is on our vocabulary to destigmatize mental health. It should be okay to speak about fear, depressive thoughts, a feeling of hopelessness in the organization. And this is very critical. It cannot be the elephant in the room that is ignored and we go around as, business as usual, right? The second step is to build psychological safety in workplaces, right? So what does this mean to experience the safety? So when individuals feel that the organization is a safe place for them to be vulnerable and that they don't feel consequences of talking about these risks, that is when it is a safe place. And what does creating these safe spaces look like right now? First and foremost, having open conversations, and it starts with the leaders. So leaders need to model being vulnerable, right? Share their own struggles, not for the sake of sharing, but truly
sharing to build connect, right? Share genuinely. And this creates permission down the organization for others to also express their vulnerability. The need to vent or to say, can I take some me time off this afternoon? Or I'm feeling vulnerable. Could I put my video off in this meeting today? And those should be the norm to be able to speak in that kind of a language. So the next, when leaders build this trust and to create the space, would be to ask feedback. What can I as a leader to support you? I think it's as simple as that. I know we have this project that is critical. How can I ease the process for you? And share transparently what is possible and what isn't. And I think you'll be amazed truly to see what employees can come up creatively with to be able to help themselves through this pandemic, right? And help each other. Very critical in this, of course, for the leaders to be ready to walk the talk. Right? An employee taking time off to care of their mental health. How does the organization treat them? How do they speak about them? And what do we do when the employee comes back to work, right? Because the rest of the organization is watching the leaders and wondering, how is this person being treated? And can I also ask for the space for myself? The third element I would look at is introducing structures that are relevant for this time being. Newer articulated rules, for instance, right? Clearer schedules and boundaries. These give stability in uncertain times. Something very simple like, hey, no Zoom Wednesdays, or prioritizing what tasks are really critical to keep the business running smoothly. Now, these structures, along with the nurturing that leaders can provide, is critical. So leaders need to find that comfort zone within themselves of holding space. Even if it doesn't come naturally to me and, dealing with emotion makes me uncomfortable. If I'm a leader, I need to find that ability to go beyond my own fear and discomfort. And it's okay for me as a leader to find that support in a coach or in a counselor to create that skill for myself of holding space. I think that is, so underlying all these initiatives, I think what I'm coming to is that leaders' own emotional reservoir, right? You cannot fill another's bucket when your own is running empty. So it's critical as leaders to seek their own support systems within their families, friends, or even professional, right? Like I said, coaches and counselors. And from that space to create the reservoir for employees in their organization. Yeah. And yeah, leaders cannot fake this. This pandemic truly calls for leaders and organizations to discover the humanness within and allow their own vulnerabilities to come to the fore.
You made some very interesting points. Thank you, Jayashree. You made some very interesting points. And how do leaders look at their own vulnerabilities and show compassion and not create a facade for other people and act decisively while being concerned about what is happening with their colleagues and so on and so forth? So very interesting points that you have raised. So we have, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of round one, and we will, without much of a break, sort of speed into round two. And simply because we are behind time a little bit, but I hope you will stay with us and not mind. I will, having gone from the compassionate point of view that Jayashree Madam raised, I will take the next question to Prahlad sir. And do we believe that as a country we can overcome this crisis from an industry leader and an entrepreneur's point of view, both of which you are, and offer unique solutions? So is there room for optimism? Prahlad sir, question to you.
First of all, thank you for your very kind words. I don't think of myself as an industry leader. Definitely, I'm an entrepreneur. I try very hard. Well, I mean, one way to look at the future is what has the history been. That's what statisticians tell you, that the future is but an extension of the past. Our country has been around for 5,000 years, maybe even 8,000. I mean, the recent Harappan excavations have put it at 8,000 rather than 5,000. We have withstood multiple migrations, multiple invasions, at least one major colonization. We have still survived. Of course, we have fractured, we have lost a few limbs, etc. We had a few bad things happen, but I think we're going to survive, and we're going to survive well. Yeah, we may lose a limb here or there, or some kind of a mythical limb. So that is one thing. I think one has to understand we are a resilient people, and we need to display that resilience and not lose hope. Now, optimism. I always quote Karl Marx. Karl Marx was asked by one of his shishyas, should we hang all capitalists? Karl Marx said, for heaven's sake, no, don't do it. They will start selling us ropes. That's what entrepreneurship is all about. Create opportunity wherever you find one. Let me go to our own software industry and tell you what we have found in the pandemic. We discovered that we are making absolutely unnecessary project trips just to give comfort to clients. Now, some guy would travel 8,000 kilometers to be with a client. And clients have now understood that it's better for us not to travel. And one specific contract I've seen demanded everything be done absolutely offsite in Bangalore. It has reduced costs. It has reduced customers' costs. Of course, few people are unhappy. They used to have frequent flyer miles and hotel stays and loyalty points. They're desperately unhappy. Bad luck to them. Travel and hospitality industry is very unhappy. But we're going to make it up to them because people will go on vacations now rather than work. And sales guys have started getting sales on Teams, Meet, and Zoom, which I never thought would happen in my lifetime. Right? E-commerce. I mean, I don't even talk about. I don't think I need to elaborate too much. It's not just another option. This is going to be one of those permanent changes now. People are used to getting things with a click. Some local supply chains will be disrupted, but I'm sure they'll find a new way to deal with the new e-commerce chain. You're seeing multiple examples as it occurs. I'm a chairperson of a medical devices company. The virus set us back very badly because we are making non-invasive infrared devices. So, we couldn't get things done. So we saw this setback and we said, let's go to the other side of the spectrum, from infrared to ultraviolet. And now we make air purifiers using ultraviolet, water purifiers using, ultraviolet rays, sanitizing boxes, so on, all kinds of things. The business is growing. Now, I'm a board advisor to another company which is making lab in a box for diabetes markers. Obviously, there's been tremendous setbacks for us for the last year. But the scientists developed a test for the SARS-CoV-2. This test has proved to be statistically a superior test, works in 2 minutes, and has been approved by IMA very recently. It will be available for sale in the next week. If you want to, we can go after opportunities. We can go get them. If not, we can keep crying. The country will be divided into 2 types of people. People who are optimistic and will go for it. And people who will keep crying and they're there forever. We can't do much about them. A lot of youngsters on the panel, in the talk. And I'm sure they're scared of what's going to happen to them in the future. I tell you the same thing that I said to myself when I passed out my BE. Our future is in our hands and not in anyone else's. Please understand this fundamental philosophy. Please do not look for someone else to help you. You're strong, you're lucky, you've passed SSLC, you've got a degree, you probably are one of, maybe 7 or 8% of the people in the world. You're extremely lucky. Please put your future into your hands. Face the world with confidence. You've learned a lot. Use that effectively. Build a great career. Thank you.
Those are good mantras, sir. Believe in yourself. You are your best friend. Take your future in your hands and work hard. And you're fortunate to have a degree, and that we are a resilient nation, survived several thousands of years. Brilliant advice. Thank you very much. Dr. Krishnamurthy will come to you next. And institutions should be careful not to assume that traditional travel opportunities are the only worthwhile study abroad experiences. So as we know, there have been a flood of people traveling from India to the United States, your part of the world, to study, get advanced degrees there in higher education. That is obviously going to change. What is the future of international education and the way ahead? What changes do you foresee, Dr. Krishnan?
Thank you. So I think the first thing, let's take on the short-term effect. If you look at this coming fall, what has happened is the universities in the US, many of them are moving to face-to-face, education, and or they may have a hybrid solution. So I think we have a whole lot of youngsters who have applied for undergraduate and master's degrees that are planning to come to the US because India is probably not opening up as fast, and there's an opportunity in the US. I think that is something that is going on. There is some confusion still there about whether Indian vaccines are going to count, and or whether they have to come to US and then get the new vaccines, but those are short term issues that are going to kind of get resolved. I think that is number one. I think number two, certainly, I think the disruption that we are going to see is that there is going to be a greater acceptance of online education, and certainly you're going to see American universities, European universities, Australian universities, etc., try to offer their educational programs to a worldwide audience. And I think at this point there is somewhat of an overstatement of content over professors, and I think that is that is going to play out. So my favorite allegory on that is student asks teacher, why do I need you when I can go watch a YouTube video? And the professor, of course, says, why don't you ask the YouTube video that question? Meaning that the professor is there to provide insight and understanding, and push the thinking of the students and so on. So I think the any claims of professors just going away in short order, I think is kind of overblown. I also think that the global digital skilling is going to take off in a big way. I know Google has just launched some new certificates, called Grow with Google, and that are going to become, well established. And I think industry will recognize, those sorts of certifications, and I believe they're still free. So certainly, I think there is going to be, that sort of an effort where you're going to have very practical digital skills go on. There is some talk about foreign universities setting up local entities in India, and creating programs of that nature. Maybe some of the larger universities will be thinking along those lines. But overall, I think there is going to be greater access to information, and it is going to become more and more common for a person anywhere in the world to gain access to knowledge, but also in some way gain access to a person who can help them navigate through that knowledge. I think that is going to be the long run. But in the business school world, we always listen to the corporate sector and try to understand where they are going as they evolve. So should we. And I think so. There is going to be some interest in trying to figure out where the business world is going. In the US, the two big things that are happening are the digital transformation. How do we prepare our students for that? And one of the big questions that everybody is asking is, how do we robot proof our the future of our students, where we give them the necessary skills so that some automation is not going to take away their job. That is a question that is everywhere. And I think in addition to that, there is a lot of interest in the US now to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And increasingly, we are also talking about, belongingness to an organization as being very important. I think these are the sorts of things that are playing out in the short run, and so it will be fascinating to see. But overall, I'm optimistic that there is going to be a greater democratization of education.
You made some fascinating points, and what I picked up last was, loyalty towards an organization is back against loyalty to a profession, which was what we were seeing for many years. That's a fascinating point of view, actually. And let me think a little bit more about it, and maybe I'll reach back to you when I think I have an answer. Thank you, Dr. Krishnamurthy. And also about the digitization of education and robot proofing it and so on and so forth. And yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. And Jayashree madam will come to you next again. And I think you made some very interesting points about compassion and empathy and so on and so forth. Something along those lines. How can we improve a sense of belonging and bonding during lockdown and working remotely? All of us are having a frustrating time. At least I am. Have we lost the skills of being in the physical presence of each other? So there are people who have actually been away from the workplace for maybe a couple of years now, going down, or at least a year and a half. So when they return, are they going to have problems? What are your views?
Thank you, Captain Nagaraj. So like you said, we went from a society, as a society, we went from distinct work and home personas that we had to blurred boundaries during the pandemic, right? So working from home, it's easy to hide with the Zoom video off. You could, student could practically hop out of bed in your pajamas and join in straight for a call. So the thing is, in this pandemic, some folks discovered ways to enjoy their own company. So maybe they turn online to replace the physical connect. For some, it was a very difficult time because those calls intruded into their home and personal life. And for the first time, maybe their home life was made visible to their colleagues across, right? So what happens when these folks get back into the office, right? Or for that matter, when students get back into physical colleges? Now, that is the question that institutions and leaders need to answer, because there is going to be a transition time, and organizations need to curb the enthusiasm to go, business as usual from the day one. And as Mr. Jairaj said, some folks may still be dealing with the post-traumatic stress disorder when they come back into work, and they may not even be aware that this is what they are kind of, dealing with. So I would like to start though with what Dr. Sandeep said earlier, that we will come out stronger, that we will discover the resilience. Possibly some will need more support than others. So what I'm going to focus on is on those that require that greater degree of support. What can we do to ease that transition into the workforce, right? For starters, and again, I'm quoting Dr. Sandeep, that the fear can continue. The vaccine today is unfortunately not the end of our troubles, right? We don't know what the future entails. And then there is the post-trauma issues like, let's say, physical health issues like obesity, for instance, hyperarousal that we see, substance abuse, sense of alienation, thought suppression. Now, these are all not going to magically disappear when folks return to the workspace, right? So, so to remain competitive in the future, what employers and leaders will need to look at is also pay attention to the employees' quality of life even outside the office, right? And that work-life balance. To some extent, the pandemic allowed employees to work from home and connect with families, right? Employees also had time to rethink about their life and where their life and career is headed. And some have taken important calls during this phase on how they would like to live and work the rest of their life. Right? And employees that are coming back will remember how their organizations treated them during their difficult days. So some of the specific challenges that I think we need to watch out for and address and create that space for bonding that Captain Nagaraj was talking about. Uh, First and foremost, to address that pressure of bringing business back to normal. Now, that is going to be high, right? But the employees may not be ready for that rigor. So make space for healing. I talked about structure and nurture earlier. So that nurturing, of course, needs to continue. Possibly flexible structures for some more time to ease that transition. Yeah. Because the thing is that with mental illness, that you could have hidden behind that Zoom call of 40 minutes while you were working from home. But when you turn up in office, you will not be able to hide the battles of your mind. So, and it will show up, right, to ease those transitions. The second part is that the whole work-life balance conundrum, right? Calls have been happening at obscene times. So that expectation of working practice might unfortunately seep in when people come back to work, and work-life balance can get truly worse. So what we need is to then put consciously more structures into place to ensure that leaders don't unintentionally transition those. Workers that have downsized, workers that have cut salaries, for instance, uh, that would impact the culture of the organizations when folks come back, right? Employees can feel wary, employees could have lost trust. So how do we win those trust back? I think when employees come back, this is the base in which we're going to start building bonds from. And this has to be consciously focused on by the leaders. How do we get those water cooler conversation back, those lunchtime bonding back? Now, those are what organizations have to consciously build processes around, right? We need to identify the most vulnerable ones, possibly go back to those good old buddy system that supports fresh recruits. So use those to get those that are, even before the pandemic, had difficulties in relating and bonding, because those are going to be alienated the most. Yeah. And people that thrived on social connect, that have found alternative ways of recharging in the pandemic, possibly online, or those that have been so occupied with their own stress that they can't truly relate to the suffering of the other. Now, these are other avenues that we need to focus on. So what I'd like to say, in closing, is that how do we bring that alive, that the bond harmony back into teams, is to address the transition that I've been talking about, to make that transition easier by focusing on the stress that employees are bringing back into the workspace. And the bonding will naturally then flow from that space. Over to you, Captain Nagaraj.
Thank you, Jayashree. That was nice. Also, I ran a quick dipstick survey sometime back on LinkedIn when I asked people whether they thought their organizations were supportive. A good 65% said they thought so. So, in a sense, what you are saying is to whether organizations really keep that psychological contract with their employees and don't do things that cause damage in that relationship is very important. And also, if I heard you correctly, things are not going to improve like a flick of a switch as soon as the pandemic ends, when people go back to work. There is to be a lot of still compassion, empathy, understanding, and a space for nurturing. Thank you. Dr. Ravichander will come to you next, and we still got you with the government. So as COVID lockdowns are lifted and the workplaces reopen, and hopefully they will soon, what support can businesses in Bengaluru receive from the government at large?
Yeah, thank you for yet another relevant question. What I would like to say is that the first thing that comes to my mind is to focus on livelihoods and lives of people. Before I state that, sometimes it becomes very difficult when you become the third or the fourth speaker, because the three panelists before me have already spoken beautifully on some of the things and taken away some of my points, but that doesn't matter. I'll just share what I think is important from my side. So from an industry perspective, one of the biggest challenges is restarting businesses and operations. There's also going to be a human resource perspective. So what is it that the government can give, or what is it that that businesses can give? One is, first of all, to segmentize the problems into different buckets, because not everyone or not one person can handle all the problems or address it. So as I mentioned earlier, go back to the basic root cause or root problem and put it into buckets. The government can play a very important role is, first of all, they need to take a middle path. There is no right or left. There has to be a middle path approach. We have learned from the first lockdown, when it finished, a lot of lessons from there. In fact, our organization brought out 3 reports on COVID. It's there on our website, and it's very, I won't say it's one of the best reports, but it's a great report in terms of a lot of data analytics went into it, and it was a very quick turnover that we did. I also think the government should bring in a sort of a policy or a restrictions that the opening of industries should be phased out. For example, we have recommended that bare essentials. It's just happening, but it's not happening in a way that it should happen with protection. For example, I haven't stepped out of home in the second lockdown. During the first lockdown, when they were opening hours, I still saw people without mask and no social distancing. I think it's also important at this point of time for both the government, industries, and other stakeholders like organizations like ours, academic institutions like yours, is to have open dialogues, not in a webinar, but actually have a one-to-one dialogue to see how improvements can be made. Again, every time we blame the government didn't do that, the government didn't do that. How many of us have stepped forward to say, you haven't done, or you can do it this way? And that's why policy institutes like ours become very important, because ultimately it should be a win-win situation for all. I also think something that has to be very strongly done by the government to ensure businesses run is enforce the security for even the police. We've seen so many incidents where police are brutally beaten because they take care of the people and they say people not to the same. I think that part of the education is something that is very important. And also ensure at all places of convergence, whatever little is there, that hygiene, sanitization, wearing mask is a must. In fact, most of us have now adapted the a mask as part of our wardrobe. Most of us, I have at least. I think as an organization, one of the things that we can do with the business houses is to build roadmaps for the government to see how we need to roll out, say, for example, even something as simple as rolling out for the vaccine. It's pretty haywire. Government is sometimes trying to address it in the best possible way, but obviously due to various reasons, it's not possible for them alone to do. I think I liked what Mr. Prahalad just mentioned some time back. You students are in a fantastic situation where you can play a role to ensure in that space that things are done by voicing your opinion, writing, publishing blogs, writing policy briefs, because I come as a communicator also, because I don't see many of you all actually putting your words, your thoughts in words, and that is very, very important. The other thing is, I think a lot of countries, like Mr. Jarad said, the US has been able to confine the cases. These are some of the best practices that our government and business houses can learn. How do they manage? Of course, everybody will ask me just now, but India is such a big country. So what? So what? We need to look at things with a magnifying glass to make it look larger. It's not that it's not possible. Last but not the least, I keep telling this to everyone, let us also try to bring in a lot of positive story and positiveness. I think it's very important for the way forward. And I think that's already been mentioned by my co-panelists before I did. Because There's so much of negativity that is lying around. There's so much of hurt. There's so much of sadness that a lot of us are going back into that. But I think we should try to look for that ray of hope at the end of the tunnel and pray that things will change. And I'm sure it will change because we've seen it in a lot of other places. So that's me. Thank you, Captain. I know I sounded like a little bit of a philosopher, but I had no other choice but to bring out some points that I really felt sincerely from my heart.
So we are a land of philosophers, so you're in the right place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Dr. Shivram Krishna, Shashi, in many senses, you have the final question, but in many ways, all people on this panel are fortunate that we have access to higher education. We have had higher education, but what about the absolute poor? And definitively our heart goes out to them. So India's Economic Survey 2016-17 proposed a gradual implementation of the concept of universal basic income as the fastest way of providing long-term solutions to poverty, which has been accentuated by the pandemic. Large-scale inequality and poverty, along with huge misallocation and wastages in the existing welfare schemes, make India a perfect ground for experimenting with UBI. What are your thoughts on this, Shashi?
Okay. Let me just make a couple of points. I heard all the speakers, and you bring in all of them brought in a business perspective, right? Mr. Jairaj, just before the meeting started, asked me what do I do for my bread and butter. So I run a business. I've been doing it for 30 years. It's in aerospace materials. So I completely agree with everyone that we have to be positive. When we are doing business, we cannot depend on the state for everything. It's our motivation, and that's business. But I never mix macroeconomics with business, because the first lesson that we learn in macroeconomics is what we call the fallacy of composition. We cannot extrapolate from individual experiences to the macroeconomy. It's very dangerous. And this was actually pointed out by John Maynard Keynes and later by Michael Kalinske, Polish economist. And it's very dangerous to do that. So I never mix business and macroeconomics. For me, they're very different. So when I speak as a macroeconomist, right, and when I speak about the role of the state, it's not that I'm not for hard work or it's free money or something like that, right? The economy will not be able to revive itself. And that's what history has taught us. The Great Depression, you needed massive state intervention. Japan in the 1990s, they have a debt to GDP ratio of 250%. The Japanese economy is not short of innovators or entrepreneurs, but it will tank if they don't spend. The Great Recession taught us that, and the pandemic has taught us that. The US is back on its feet because of a fiscal deficit of 20%, because the Fed expanded its balance sheet by $8 trillion. Okay. So if you don't do that, whatever innovation you have, you will not be able to sustain yourself. And you cannot, like you said, we have education and we have so many things, but everything will collapse. You need massive state intervention during a crisis. History has taught us that, not now, from the 1800s. It's been happening, and evolution of institutions is exactly because of that. So according to me, we cannot escape that. Now coming to the UBI, it's one way of addressing the crisis. In these times, it could be very important because it gives money in people's hands. And you need demand today, right? Because once businesses revive, if demand is not there, they might actually collapse again. So putting purchasing power in people's hand directly is definitely required. There's no doubt about that. They're doing it already in some sense. If you look at India's fiscal deficit, it's also gone up to 10% almost, 9.3% last year. It has to happen. It's an automatic stabilizer. You do what may, the fiscal deficit will expand because your tax revenues fall and your spending on Manrega and so on will increase. So there's no way you can control your fiscal deficit. Austerity has failed across the world. It doesn't work. So I think in the short term, I would definitely agree for a UBI. in the longer term, I would replace the UBI with a universal job guarantee program. I think that's really very important for India, both rural and urban, because there are millions of people who are not working, not able to find work when they're looking for work. And that's, we are wasting our resources. There are people who want to work and there are companies who want to sell. So I think you have to put money in people's hand. And, the job guarantee program that we have in India, which is only one of its kinds in the world, because there's no other country which has work as a guarantee provided by the state as a human right in some sense, is a fantastic achievement. And you can do fantastic work with it. Like simple projects that they're doing in Manreka are amazing to me. Like building soap pits around homes and so on, rural homes and so on. You can reduce the incidence of dengue, for example, and that's going to bring about increases in productivity. So I think longer term, we should not think of a UBI, but you should think of a universal job guarantee, because you're also adding to productivity. UBI doesn't add to productivity, right? So it can be a cause for inflation in the longer term. I think you need something which adds to productivity so you can take care of inflation. It's a more sustainable program. The last comment I would like to make is that I look at macroeconomics from what we call as a modern money theory perspective, right? And it's something which is now becoming quite imminent in the US also as an evolving paradigm. And what it says is that a sovereign country like India, for instance, which has its own currency, right, does not face a financial constraint. India cannot go broke in rupees. It's impossible. You can leverage this power of the state, right, without immediate concern to bring a country out of a crisis. And we should do more. According to me, there is no financial constraint, but there are real resource constraints. So, money alone doesn't do the job, but it's required. Okay. And I think, especially to sustain demand, I think at this point, a UBI and not something really small, I think a substantial one is what we require today. Need not be universal. We can exclude, high taxpayers and so on. We don't have to bring them in. It's easy to eliminate a few, maybe. Or you can go in for a universal. I don't think they're going to, and maybe just tweak the tax rates a little for the rich or something. So if that's easier to administer, I would wholeheartedly go for a UBI today. Longer term, for a universal job guarantee. Thank you. That's my take.
Thank you, Shashi. So we've had a wonderful discussion, and over probably an hour or so, we extended a little bit. Thank you, everybody, for the deep insights and the enthusiasm. And I will hand it back to the students now to take a couple of questions. We have had a series of questions being posed, and Rakhi, all yours. We will sort of, I will request Jairat sir to wind up towards the end, but if you could take a few quick questions, the audience round.
Sure, sir. Okay. My name is Rakhi Kesharwani, and I thank everyone for this wonderful session. And we have a great set of questions lined up from the audience. And as sir said, Prahlad sir or Jairat sir, please wind it up at the end. And I would like to move forward for the question of Professor H.N. Shankar, which is, what are the major changes expected in ways of business and people's life? So I would ask Prahlad sir to go forward with this question, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think, how are you, Professor Shankar? Great seeing you again. Well, I mean, life is going to change. It's not going to be the same the way we know it. I think Jayashree has eloquently described the kind of mental changes that have happened and the ways to address it to bring back to some sort of normalcy. So first of all, at the mind level, yeah, there's going to be a major change. Second, cities were formed because capital was scarce. People had to move to a place of the factory. People had to move to the place of work, and therefore, we congregated in cities. Now, a significant number of us need not congregate in cities. Now, this was going to go, maybe happen 30 years from now. This work from home and all that. And now perhaps it's going to be accelerated. Maybe you'll find a significant number of people moving away from the city into more open area, thanks to the pandemic. I think that's one change I see. Next change I've seen is hyper nationalism, which is one of the biggest dangers, because everyone has to protect their turf, etc., etc. I mean, we could go on, but most things will change. Most things as we know it will change. We have to recast ourselves in a big way. But about 70% may continue as is. We'll still continue to eat good food. Vidyarthi Bhavan, Masala Dosa will continue to be good.
Thank you so much, Prahlad sir. And before going to the next question, I would like to request all the participants to download the certificates from the link in the chat box below. The link will be open till 9 p.m. today. Okay. So moving on to the next question, and this is from my fellow classmate, Mr. Ravi Kiran. So the question is, even though after 75 years of independence and currently 1.5% of GDP is being allocated to the health infrastructure, what could have been the additional measures taken from the management sector to suppress positive cases and death? Sir, Captain Nagraj sir, whom should I forward the question to?
So you're talking about why so little money is being allocated to the health sector, and why not do more? So maybe Shashi could sort of tell us a little bit about it. He's the economist.
I think the question had more on a business. Anyway, it's by choice. I think we have failed there completely. Primary health and primary education has been a big failure in India, no doubt about it. I think it was a bad choice to make, to allocate so little to health and education. I think that, if you look at rural healthcare and so on, and in fact, it was better actually. In the 60s and 70s, things began to improve. Actually, till the 90s, if you look at even Uttar Pradesh, things improved. It's actually to some extent the privatization of healthcare also, which has led to a breakdown of primary health. I cannot pinpoint a definite cause and effect, but there is a definite link between the two.
Dr. Annapurna, would you like to chip in?
I completely agree with Sashi when he says education and health, which are both overlinked or interlinked, have not been given enough importance at all. And I think where we and the government failed to recognize this, by doing it, we've seen in the past that it is an important aspect and it has brought in development. But moving on to other things and ignoring it completely or even a little bit, the government has failed. We have failed to even talk about it. But I can say that, again, being a positive and optimistic person, as an organization, we have been working towards this using data with the planning department to ensure, especially we picked up about 7 of the SDG goals, one of them being education and also health. And we are actually corporatizing and building roadmaps. That's why roadmaps become a very important element in helping government to build policies, implement policies, and hopefully sustain it in a long time. So I completely agree with Sachi that it's not a great decision. It was not a great decision.
So thank you. So I have a question of my own, Rakhi, and we'll have to wind up. We're seriously running out of time before we bring in Mr. Jairaj. So this question actually is to Sandeep. Sandeep, you just come out of 4 tumultuous years of presidentship, and then you got now Joe Biden. So do you see this hyper nationalism thing? Is it in India, or do you see it in the US as well? And you're an Indian, but you have lived in the US. You are an American citizen, and so on. So just tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. Yeah, I think I don't want to get too political with this, but I think the big message is that globalization really had negative impacts in the US that we're just coming to grips with. And in particular, I think, entire states, entire sectors were gutted, and there were a whole bunch of people who were left behind, in some industrial sectors, for example, mining, traditional manufacturing, things like that, many factories were shut down. And so globalization and digitization were the two big forces that led to that, but globalization was probably the bigger of the two. So certainly, I think that has led to, as economic power gets taken away from those individuals, I think there has been a massive surge in those people, pushing for nationalism and populism, meaning that they want their agendas to be at the top of the table. And 70 million people voted for Trump in the last election, in the second election. So I think this is a massive force that is part of the US dynamic now. And I think Biden is trying to build a coalition, and so far he has kept things pretty calm. His leadership style has been much more calming, and he's shown focus. Basically, he is focused on rolling out the vaccines, in a very significant way. But some of the larger agenda items that he's trying to grow is along the lines that Shashi was talking about. He wants to essentially take a Keynesian view of having the government bring in infrastructure, jobs, and I think the first serious resistance is starting to form around that, with Republicans wanting different things than Democrats. But overall, I think the kind of nationalism in the US is a strong force, maybe a little submerged under in the Biden era, but it is nobody is assuming that it has gone away, and that Trumpism also was brought some ugly things, like things like racism, sexism to the fore, where it was very disrespectful time in terms of rupturing relationships between the US and long-standing trusted allies. So the hope is that some of those relationships can be reclaimed as well. But certainly I think this is this type of a dynamic of pushing for narrow agendas on nationalist and populist grounds will be part of the US rhetoric for the next decade at least, I think.
Thank you. Yep. Jayashree, I'll reach back to you maybe for a half an hour session with our students sometime later, where you can tell them about how to build resilience. And that please do oblige us with that conversation. I think it's very important. Yeah?
Sure, it will be my pleasure, Captain Nagraj. And I'm very glad that institutes like yours are taking this seriously and providing that platform to the students. Sure.
Thank you. So, Rakhi, with your permission, if I may invite Mr. Jairaj, if he's... Jairaj, sir, are you? Can you wind up for us, please? Okay. So, Rakhi, back to you.
Okay, so thank you so much, panelists, for answering many questions, because due to the shortage of time, we won't be able to take all of these. I'm very thankful to all of you about this. So with this, I would thank all the panelists, professors, and dear participants. It's an honor to have been asked to offer vote of thanks on this occasion. Once a great man whispered, feeling thankfulness and not expressing it is like wrapping a present and not giving it. So today, I would take all the opportunities to put all my gratitude into words. It's a matter of pride for me that I'm proposing the vote of thanks for this meeting. On behalf of Dayanand Sagar University and the DSS committee, my heartfelt gratitude to all the speakers for sharing their graceful words in today's meeting. It has been an honor to host for all the audience and members in the meeting, and I'm thankful to all the participants for coming here and attending this webinar. We have been fortunate to have panelists of renowned identity. I must remark a profound sense of gratefulness to all the panelists of today's webinar. The way the speaker talked today is totally exemplary. I take this occurrence to thank the entire DSS committee as well as the audience for being present in this session. Well, an event like this cannot happen overnight. So the wheel starts rolling weeks ago. It requires planning and a bird eye for a detail. So we have been fortunate enough to be backed by a team of wonderful teaching faculties, along with very motivated and dedicated members of DSS who know their job and are very result oriented. I would like to express my gratitude to them as well. Once again, thank you for this wonderful session. With this, I would like to conclude my vote of thanks, and I would again ask.
Yeah, Raki. So we'll change after the vote of thanks. We'll give a few words to Gerard sir, who's back. Sir, please wind up for us and.
Thank you, Captain. It's very unusual to speak after the vote of thanks. This is standing convention on its head, but I'll be very brief. And I have really benefited from this 1.5 hours, almost 2 hours interaction, in which we heard various perspectives from D.N. Prahalad, from Professor Sandeep Krishnamurthy, from Jayashree, from Shashi, and from Annapurna. And I was thinking, Captain, that since a majority of your students are here and faculty also, this merits more serious discussion and a study group approach from among your students, where you can circulate the recording to them and they can kind of discuss in detail what, for instance, Prahalad spoke about leadership, or Annapurna about public policy, governance, or Shashi or Jayashree on mental health, or Professor Sandeep Krishnamurthy, who made very thoughtful and perceptive comments. And I really request you, Captain, to let the students, dissect this and digest it, because this is a real lesson for them, so to speak, on how to think through these tough times and what to do to prepare themselves. So that's my request to you. And I would also, Captain, take this opportunity to congratulate you for the great leadership you have exercised in bringing together such a panel. I don't know what time it is for Professor Krishnamurthy. What's the time there, sir, in Washington, Seattle?
It's 8:15 in the morning now, but we started around,
It's not an ungodly hour. It's not an ungodly hour. And
no, it's fine.
We are really grateful to you, and I hope you'll continue your association with the School of Business at DSU, and of course my dear friend Professor Dr. Mr. Prahalad, who really brought such perceptive observations, and Sasi and Jayashree and Annapurna. So grateful to all of you on behalf of our Vice Chairman of DSU, and look forward to your continued engagement. And also like to thank the student organizers for really their very spirited performance. Of course, they got my name wrong, Captain, but that's not to be held against them. So thank you very much. And Captain, over to you. Thank you for inviting me, Captain.
Thank you so much, sir. As usual, you summed it up brilliantly. Next time, we will get your name right. And I'm sure we'll make sure about that. And thank you so much, sir, for being here and for your time. Thank you for all the distinguished panelists. Also, Dr. Krishnamurthy for joining us from the United States and making it is a pretty tough hour for him in the morning, as well as Dr. Shashi Shivaram Krishna, Dr. Ravichander, Jayashree, and Prahalad, sir. Thank you so much. And students, wonderful job as usual. I would also like to thank Professor Rajan and Professor and Mr. Imtiaz, who sets it up for us, as always, brilliantly.
Very well.
Always, yes, sir. Thank you very much. And students, again, brilliant job. Till we meet again. Good night.
Stay safe, and faculty and students and all our dear panelists, please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good day and good night.
Thank you, teachers.
Thank you.